Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. In my next video covering the printed adventures of our favorite archaeologists, I'm taking a look at the two 2009 books from Scholastic featuring Indiana Jones. This was supposed to be part, or I should say the start of a new series of Scholastic books based on Indy, which were going to be called the Untold Adventures of Indiana Jones. Each would be a standalone new adventure by a variety of authors in a young adult novel, just like what we saw in the really fantastic Scholastic Star Wars prequel fiction, of which the Jedi Apprentice series was the real standout alongside Jedi Quest and then The Last of the Jedi. So this was really a fascinating series to jump into, but unfortunately it only lasted the two books. But nicely, each was written by someone who was not a stranger to Star Wars, who had dabbled in Star Wars books for a great number of years. The first was by Ryder, who wrote a number of the great Scholastic Star Wars books, and also would write one of the Scholastic novelizations of the films that they redid as trilogy novelizations for Crystal Skull as well. And the second was written by the late J.W. Rinzler, of course, famous for his making of Star Wars trilogy books and essentially becoming the de facto Lucasfilm historian. So it was fascinating to see him take a stab at telling his own Indy adventure. The only thing is the books do have a loose connection because they are a series. So like the other Scholastic Star Wars series, you do need to read these in chronological order if you can, because one story very much does flow into the other or make several connections. So this would have continued in the rest of the books, and it would probably have followed the same formula and probably been a 10-book series. But it was canceled, probably due to low sales, but also due to the unfortunate fact that Indiana Jones merch has never been properly supported in the way that Star Wars merch is. So all Indy merch is usually not promoted well, usually gets canceled at some point, doesn't get supported all that much, and there's not a lot of fanfare, so usually fans find out after the fact. I myself didn't get a chance to read these before now. I had heard of them over the years, but I didn't even know about them back in 2009. I did read Army of the Dead, which is the standalone Steve Perry novel that I've also reviewed on this channel. This was the only adult novel that was done after Crystal Skull and remains the last Indiana Jones novel there is, unfortunately. But even this was not well promoted and was not received by the fans very well, but it just kind of came and went very quickly, and this was a major Del Rey published novel. So if the adult novel Army of the Dead was not supported very well and didn't really make much of a splash, then there's no way the Scholastic books were going to have a bigger impact than that. And so I think that's why Scholastic quickly canceled the series. And of course, it didn't help that the reception to the Crystal Skull film was, shall we say, terrible. I think it kind of soured a lot of people on Indy adventures. So with all that said, looking at these now, you do have to track down copies like the other Scholastic Star Wars books. They are getting trickier to find, but since these are only part of a 2-volume canceled series, they didn't go through a lot of print runs, so they are more difficult to find than the Star Wars books, but you can usually track them down for a couple bucks each if you're patient. And you may be thinking to yourself, well, they're Scholastic books, they're books for kids, they can't possibly be that entertaining or gripping, and they'll have to make so many concessions in terms of the fisticuffs and violence and love scenes and things like that. Which is understandable, but if you've ever read any of the Scholastic Star Wars fiction, you would know that they have a very high quality standard in the storytelling and in the characterizations. And in fact, for me, the single best thing about the prequels are the Scholastic Star Wars series, particularly Jedi Apprentice, which actually fleshes out the Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon relationship to such a degree that it only informs the actual prequel films. So I can't watch the prequels without thinking about prequel expanded universe material, because it did a lot of the heavy lifting that the films didn't do in terms of storytelling, character development, and plot setup. So with this factor, and also knowing and really respecting the different authors' other work, I did have, pretty decent expectations going into these, but I figured they would just sort of be enjoyable but not particularly memorable, since the series only lasted 2 books and it just kind of came and went, and obviously they were not going to stack up against some of the 13 adult novels that I've just read and reviewed and gone through chronologically. I was wrong. I was severely wrong. Yes, these are still books for children. Yes, they're for young adult readers, so I guess technically more like preteen range. But like a lot of these Scholastic books, they pack a punch. And to be quite frank, even though the actual page count is more limited because the font is bigger and the actual number of pages is less, so obviously the stories have to have a certain streamlining quality to them, and the authors are not allowed the luxury of having more time for character development and things, and have to also find more creative ways to write the violence, to tone it down in areas, to make it more palatable for children reading these. These are great indie adventures, pure and simple. You can tell both of the writers had a field day trying to write the best indie story they could come up with in the constraints, and it's like something they had burning inside of them that they really wanted to do. Quite frankly, these are better than most of the adult novels. It's just unbelievable. I mean, I figured these would be pretty good, but wow. I should have known better, knowing the writer's other work and knowing the Scholastic Star Wars books. But again, with it only being 2 books and then the series getting canceled and no one really talks about it, you just sort of tell yourself, oh, these won't be that important. I'll read them someday, maybe. Well, please read them sooner rather than later, because these are so well done that it makes you really regret that the series was canceled after 2 books. And while I do think one is stronger than the other, they very much are connected at the hip, because book 1 leads directly into book 2, which is how the Scholastic books would do. So it's part of an overarching a story overall in terms of what would have been the 10 books. But the indie spirit is even in how the actual series becomes launched, because this book series essentially would have been Indy in the early stages, and then at the onset of World War II, getting into government work, because in the first book, he gets to hook up with not old buddy, not old pal Musgrove, who of course is one of the army men from Raiders of the Lost Ark. And so there's no love lost there. And even the setup in the first book, which is Pyramid of the Sorcerer, how they even meet face to face, is quite striking and has a really great series of action beats to open the series and the first book. But essentially, the series would have been each book being a particular assignment that Musgrove would have given Indy and whoever he was teamed or partnered with at the time, to try to obtain or find out more about particular artifacts before the Nazis could get their hands on them. So, of course, it's working in the Raiders of the Lost Ark playbook, but that's what an Indiana Jones story is, and that's most likely what Indy's activities working for the OSS would have gotten him into, because the Army would have wanted to use his particular talents. And all of this stuff is set up perfectly and executed perfectly here in the first book, continued in the second, and this is being done in a young adult children's series, which does such a better job of setting the world and the tone of Indiana Jones and matching the original trilogy of films, but also having Indy here in 1941, moving into the point where the U.S. would enter World War II. It does a better job of Indiana Jones than either Crystal Skull or Dial of Destiny, that's for sure, and it does a better job of Indiana Jones than most of the Bantam novels, and it certainly does a heck of a better job than Army of the Dead did. So let that one sink in. The Scholastic Kids books from 2009 are, the purest indie adventures in years. I mean, I would say they are definitely the best since Max McCoy's Bantam novels, which were the last of the Bantam series. And quite frankly, the Scholastic books, they're more focused and have more of indie spirit and feel like the films and make direct references to other elements of the indie canon that they feel a bit more consistent and directly connected to the rest of the indie canon than a lot of the Bantam books. And In both of these Scholastic books, there are references made to the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. There are references made to the films, of course, to the original trilogy, because this is still happening before Crystal Skull, but it's designed to perfectly fit in the official Indy canon. So these are canon stories where some, particularly the earlier Bantam novels, is still debated among fans if they're technically fully canon or not. Interestingly, in the first book, there's even a mention of Sophia Hapgood and events from the Fate of Atlantis game, which is the great and best Indiana Jones game. And so we even have an olive branch to Fate of Atlantis here. So this is very much a little hidden gem of the official Indy canon. And the stories move along with a good pace, but again, you don't have a lot of page count and time to play around. You've got to get in and tell the story, and it's fascinating to see how both authors are able to pull off set piece after set piece after set piece that are inventive and action packed, and allow Indy to rely on his wits and really display his character. The Indy of these books feels purer and more like the Indy we know and love than most of the adult novels do, which again is a bizarre concept, but I just had an absolute blast reading these. I was literally sitting there going, why did I not read these before? The first book, Pyramid of the Sorcerer, has Indy essentially going after the fabled lost Hall of Records, which, in terms of it containing records of the past, present, and future of all humanity, it does very much work on the same theme as McCoy's last novel, Secret of the Sphinx, having the Omega book, which essentially did the same thing, and that's what everybody was after. Here, interestingly, the Hall of Records is not a central location. It actually moves around in strange and mysterious ways once it is discovered or after a certain period of time. So Indy has to do a lot of actual detective and archaeological work in these books, just like the real Indy would do. We also have a nice contingent of villains who I won't reveal because there are some nice red herrings and a final plot reveal of who the true villain is. So we do have double crosses and things, and Indy doesn't exactly know who the villain is. Again, all of this is crammed into a small Scholastic young adult book. And then we even have a fantastic love interest who is the pilot character who gets Indy to South America, and this is Burt Brodowski, who is also in the second book. So essentially, I think what they were trying to do with this series was also have a variety of different female characters to essentially be part of Indy's group or be the major love interest, and keep that sort of revolving door idea of what we saw in the original trilogy with the three different love interests. And the character of Burt, again, I'm a sucker for 30s style heroines, especially if they have guys' names. And interestingly, Windham even gives her a broken nose, which is, I think, possibly a direct reference to Fleming doing the same thing in Dr. No and giving Honey Ryder a broken nose, and that being an extremely endearing aspect of her character, that she has this adorable nose that's slightly crooked. So that, I thought, was, if it was a nod to Fleming's Bond novels, I really appreciated that as a giant Fleming fan. But the love interest character is better realized. Her banter is better with Indy, and she's a more likable, well-rounded character in these two young adult books than most of the love interests in the adult novels. So again, we have another element that manages to be better realized and better executed than a lot of what is in the adult books. And I liked a lot of the love interests in the adult novels, but some I thought were not as developed as I would have liked. And the banter between Burt and Indy in these two books are exactly what you'd expect in a classic 30s screwball, and have the air of Indy and Marion scrapping and back and forth, or Indy and Willie scrapping back and forth. Also, this character is a tough pilot who has seen it all, or at least she thinks she's seen it all, and that leads to a lot of amusing back and forth between the two. And again, she reappears in the second book. The next book is Mystery of Mount Sinai, which has Indy on another mission directly following the events of the first book, along with Bert in tow. He gets this mission from Musgrove, essentially, to go after a particular artifact rumored to exist before the villain of the piece, who is General Musgrove, a power-mad Nazi villain with a whole host of names and a very flamboyant character, can get his hands on it. And if that were not enough, J.W. Rinzler pulls directly out of the classical Indy playbook by using elements that were never used in one of the films. Originally, if you go back to the early development of Raiders, the character of Tote was supposed to have a mechanical arm, and then that later popped up again in the Chris Columbus script for the unmade Monkey King Indiana Jones film, which also had a character with the Mephisto name. So essentially Rinzler was riffing on those because his character of Mephisto is a Nazi general with a robotic arm that also has the ability to sort of shoot energy projectiles or beams or things. So he's not somebody you want to trifle with. And I was just so excited to finally see that Nazi officer with the robot arm finally make it into something, because there's some really great concept drawings of that version of Tote when Raiders was being developed. So it's such a cool pulpy idea that you think it would be in one of the films. I thought they were going to do that in Dial of Destiny and riff on that, but unfortunately they didn't, like every other unfortunate aspect of that film. But it was just really fascinating to see that here. The adventure winds up finishing in Egypt around Mount Sinai, but also has our heroes go to Italy, where there's a whole set piece sequence that takes place inside Vatican City, where Indy has to get information out of a particular volume in the Vatican Library, just as the opposing forces are there. And there's even a rather amusing meeting or crossing of paths between Indy and Mussolini, which of course is reminiscent of the same thing happening with Hitler in Last Crusade. So even when these books are making direct callbacks to the films, they're refashioning some of those elements, so you can tell it's a tip of the hat, but it's not simply regurgitating it. Also, interestingly, and perhaps most rewardingly, we do have mentions of other characters and events from the Young Indy Chronicles as well to keep things canon, but we also have Indy and Bert stop for a particular expert's opinion on an artifact, and that, of course, is Indy's father, Henry Sr. So we have a whole scene with Henry Sr., the immortal Sean Connery Henry Sr., which is well written, is really enjoyable. There's a lot of embarrassment at Indy's expense, and it's just fantastic to see that, because we've never gotten much of anything with that character outside of Last Crusade, the film, or the novelization. The Henry Jones character doesn't really pop up in the adult novels outside of Indy flashing back to things or mentioning his father or thinking something about his father. There's not a direct scene, say, for example, in Army of the Dead, which seems like a missed opportunity to not have other characters, particularly Indy's father, appear in any of the Indy novels in a major new scene. Well, you get that here in Mount Sinai. Ultimately, I do think the second book, Mount Sinai, is a little... It's just a little bit lesser when you stack it up against the first book, which has the adventure a bit more constant, but they're very much of the same piece, because they are joined directly together, and book one leads into book two, and both are ridiculously enjoyable. And book two ends with essentially the relationship between Indy and Bert ending in a sort of way, and then also each of the villains of the books have a nice grisly enough demise, of course, as much as a Scholastic book would allow for, so they do get the nice Indy climax with supernatural elements, but also a nice gory demise. But you can very much tell that book two ends and it sets up the book three that we never got. So these were very much designed to lead directly into another and also each book would have a new adventure, but some elements might tie into previous or forthcoming books, and then there might be a couple story arcs that ran throughout all of them and would finally get wrapped up in the last book, and it probably would have run 10 books like the Star Wars series. To talk about the actual books themselves, we have really nice, well-done cover artwork. These have a nice sort of gloss finish on them, so they feel a little bit more premium than even some of the standard Scholastic printings, but otherwise it's a Scholastic book, so it's a little bit a larger size paperback with bigger margins, but of course rather thin. We have a nice custom spine for these that also number the books, which unfortunately stop at 2, and we nicely have the original iconic Indy font. The back is pretty simple, but at least they kept the sort of motif of the background looking like some artifact or temple, and then you see the blurb hyping up the next book. The inside has nice imagery, and we have all the wonderful Indy logos and imagery that suggests Indy, but also nicely we have each chapter has the Indy font for the chapter, which it just has a lot of that wonderful flavor that you want in an Indy book. And the top actually has the Indy font for the title on each page. Mount Sinai is a little bit different in the printing. This has the sort of firmer or reinforced cover printing, so it's still got the gloss on it, has the really nice artwork. Again, what's not to love about Indy fighting a Nazi general with a cyborg robotic arm that can shoot energy blasts on Mount Sinai? I mean, that's just... You get your money's worth just from the cover. And here is the spine. And the back is the same design, which has a blurb hyping the first book. But again, this particular printing has that, you can't really see it on camera, but it's got that thicker sort of reinforced cover, which is nice because Scholastic doesn't do this very often. Same title page, and then also having the chapter headings. Also, Sinai is a little bit longer. This is 155 pages in the Scholastic format, whereas Pyramid of the Sorcerer is 136 pages. So Scholastic books are usually around this page count, but again, you do have to keep in mind that these are bigger pages with bigger margins and bigger font. So ultimately, I just had to talk about these two books and kind of gush over them because I wish I had read these long ago. I wish I read them when they came out. I wish it was a full series and that it hadn't gotten canceled because it's a darn shame. I would say after reading all of the 13 adult novels and sampling other bits of young Indy and really trying to read every last scrap of Indy printed material there is, these are some of the best Indy books, period. If I was ranking them alongside the 13 adult novels, they would very easily be top 5 material. And I kind of count both of them together because it's basically the first book leads into the second, but I do think the first book is a bit stronger than the second one. But I'm just kind of grouping them together because they're two shorter books and the series got canceled. So if you were grouping these two together, I would at least have them in the top 5 of best Indy books of all time. And there's an argument to be made that they could even be considered the best Indy book of all time because the purity of the storytelling is such that you can actually envision everything that happens in these as if it was an Indy film. Everything fits. The writers have a field day trying to tell their own Indiana Jones story, and they pull it off beautifully, even though they are having to basically write under the constraints of it being a Scholastic novel for kids. So if you're an adult reading these, you quickly forget about that stuff, except for when there's some of the gunfights, you can tell where they're having to sort of write around the fact that, oh, well, Indy just shot a guy. So, but surprisingly, there are, people getting shot and deaths and things, but the action does not suffer, actually. There is a great deal of action, honestly, more than some of the Bantam novels, and these wipe the floor with the Army of the Dead book, which I think is okay. It's not terrible like some fans claim it is, but it doesn't really feel like an Indy book for quite a lot of it. So I think it's really surprising, and, well, not so surprising considering the Scholastic Star Wars novels level of quality, but these books definitely belong on a shelf alongside the adult novels and rank among some of the best Indiana Jones fiction ever. And I would be hard pressed to point to anything else in the sort of modern era that is a better or purer Indiana Jones experience. And that includes both Crystal Skull and Dial of Destiny, the films, the various video games, and, well, the comics had really kind of dried up after Dark Horse had published some great indie comics in the 90s. So, after the indie comics and the Bantam novels ending in 1999, I think this is the best indie material after Max McCoy's last novel in 1999. These books are fantastic. Every indie fan should read them. Don't be deterred by the fact that they are Scholastic books ostensibly for kids. These are so well done and have such spirit and heart to them that doesn't matter. And these are purer and better Indiana Jones experiences than anything in the two modern films, that's for sure. And they will bring a smile to the face and just make you excited about the character again and spark off a lot of the imagination afterwards of what could you do with Indiana Jones in this sort of setup. And it's a great setup to get Indiana Jones introduced into the war years of World War II, because they're set in 1941, just before the U.S. entry into the war. And you can see how the later books would have dealt with that and done a great job of it, even though they're books for children. So those are my thoughts on the sadly short-lived Untold Adventures of Indiana Jones series from Scholastic, published in 2009. I think these are essential indie books. They're so well done and so enjoyable that I know I'm going to be coming back and rereading these over and over and over again, and especially when I reread the Bantam novels. But these are so much easier to just pick up and have a fun adventure with that they very much stand alongside the Max McCoy novels as being the sort of best of and closest to the films in tone and spirit of all of the indie literature that I've read so far. So for me, these are probably the hidden gem of all of Indiana Jones fiction. And just because they're kids' books by Scholastic doesn't mean that they're not really great reads. So as always, I hope my babblings about our favorite archaeologists and the world of printed Indiana Jones fiction have been at least somewhat fun and informative. I strongly urge any indie fan to check out the Scholastic books. You can find them for a couple bucks each, but you do have to search local bookstores or purchase copies on eBay because they have sort of dried up. But it is very much worth it. And when you read these, you will truly regret the fact that the series was canceled after 2 books. And again, you can tell these two writers had a field day getting to write an indie adventure, and that just is apparent on every single page. And you wish these were longer. You wish they had gotten to write them as adult novels that were a bit more fleshed out, but honestly, that's not even a major problem because these are so well done that they basically feel like miniature Indiana Jones movies, and it would have been a fantastic series. And it's a great plot setup, and they are fully Indiana Jones canon. They make great references to the films and other characters, and characters reappear. They also make great references to the indie games and the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. Everything feels the way it should. Everything is well thought out, well paced, and these are just a joy. These are a joy to read, and I think any indie fan will get that in spades when they read these. As always, please do keep supporting your local independent bookstore by hopefully being able to find a copy of these wonderful Scholastic indie books. I do still see them pop up from time to time in the young adult sections, so it does pay to check around those every once in a while, because you'll see various Scholastic Star Wars books pop up, which are very underrated and very much worth your time. Every once in a while, I'll see some copies of the Scholastic indie books, which is why I finally picked up these two, because I'd just been meaning to, and now I'm just kicking myself. Why didn't I do this earlier? But definitely support your local indie bookstore by buying indie books to also help keep them in business. So as always, please do keep reading print books, keep cracking the whip, and as always, thank you ever so much for watching.